Okay, this is your lecture for Chapter 1. I'm going to try to keep this to 5 minutes, so I've got a timer on myself. In Chapter 1, what I really want to focus on are two things: defining abnormal psychology and the history of abnormal psychology. So I'm really only going to give you sort of an overview of looking at these two components. The first thing I want you to think about when you define abnormal psychology is that the definition is always based on time and culture. So what that means is that there's no one definition for abnormal behavior because it depends upon the time period we live in and the culture we live in. So it's always changing. And so that's what makes it difficult when we think about diagnosing or even thinking about what defines abnormality because it's constantly changing. Your book gives you 4 Ds. Difference, which is based upon statistical difference, which is one way that we can define it. Deviant, which is based upon the culture, what are their deviant social norms. Dangerous, which I hope you will note is actually not a good definition because most of the time people with mental illness are not dangerous. And finally, dysfunction. And this is the one that actually fits the best in terms of our definition of abnormality. And we look at 2 things. We look at personal distress. So are the issues, are the symptoms distressing to the actual person? And we also look at impairment. Is it causing them problems within their life? So that really is the best definition. I spelled it wrong here, there we go. That really is the best definition of abnormality that we can come up with. But again, it's always based upon time and culture. Finally, the history of psychology. I want you to think about it in 3 different sort of ways. The first thing I want you to think about is what is the etiology of the time period. So etiology means cause. So for a particular time period, what do they believe is the cause of mental illness? The second one is treatment. Often treatment and etiology should go hand in hand. So whatever causes the mental illness, that should lead us to what we should do to treat it. And the third one is location. Where do they treat mental illness, or where do the people with mental illness go? So for example, if we think about what I would call prehistory, or sort of the first things that we see in terms of mental illness, etiology is often superstitious. So they think that a god has possessed you, or a demon has possessed you, or there's some sort of supernatural thing that's happening. The treatment was, the common treatment that we know of was trephination, which is where they cut a hole in your skull, essentially, in order to let the evil spirits out. So etiology and treatment are actually connected there. If the problem is an evil spirit, then we have to open a door so that evil spirit can leave. Of course, that did tend to work, but it also tended to kill the person. So success is defined differently. In terms of location for prehistory, there really wasn't a location. There wasn't a place. There wasn't a hospital for people with mental illness to go. So they were either cast out and kind of roamed the wilderness, or sometimes if it was mild treatment, they would just be treated at home. So etiology and treatment and location, think about those 3 components for each kind of time period that the book talks about. We'll see an evolution. So with etiology, we'll see an evolution between superstitious stuff to maybe more biological causes, and they kind of go back and forth for a while. And then we start seeing psychological causes kind of enter into the whole scheme in terms of like trauma causing problems and things like that. So etiology now, we usually look at biological and psychological causes. Treatment, again, we're going to see an evolution. So between things like trephination, where they're opening your skull, then we'll see them do almost inhumane treatments, at least what we would think of as inhumane treatments during sort of like the 14th, 15th century, things along those lines. And then we start seeing it evolve into more moral treatment and eventually into all the different types of treatment that we have today, which I'll actually talk about when I get to Chapter 2. And finally, location. Pay attention to when the asylums were created and what the asylums were used for, and then again how that evolved into more moral treatment, more large state institutions, and then eventually deinstitutionalization, where people left the institutions and were treated more in the community. So here are just sort of some ways to sort of view Chapter 1. Of course, this isn't everything. This is just a quick 5-minute overview of things I want you to pay attention to.